Thank you very much. So this can be a little bit of a confronting topic when you start mentioning about brain damage in children, but as I say to people, you've got two choices. You can worry about the problem or you can worry about the solution. You need to be worried about the problem and embrace the solution. So snoring is a noise that is made when there is either a blockage of airflow or a disturbance in the normal airflow pattern. And that specifically obviously relates to breathing, somewhere between the nose right down to the voice box. So that's the anatomy of snoring in a nutshell. And whilst there's different types of noisy breathing, snoring is by far the most common, and it's also the most important sign of a problem. So one of the things that needs to be clarified is, are kids meant to snore? And all too often, snoring by children is ignored by the parents, and it's okay if you're snoring intermittently. So, for example, they're sick, got a really bad cold, head, nose is all blocked up and stuffy, they'll snore. Or if they've had a really just absolutely massive day, they've done their cross-country and then gone to swimming lessons and then, just completely worn themselves out, then yeah, you'll just flake out and snore. But if it's persistent snoring, that's when it's not normal. And we call it habitual snoring if it's present for 4 nights of the week or more. And habitual snoring falls into the category that we collectively call sleep disordered breathing, or SDB. And at the very worst end of this spectrum is what we call obstructive sleep apnea, and that's the thing that most people are familiar with. What people then think is, oh, they snore but they don't stop breathing, it's okay, but that's actually not true. So we can measure obstructed sleep, that's what we call a sleep study, and it's excellent for diagnosing obstructive sleep apnea, but the problem is that that's only part of the spectrum of sleep disordered breathing. So when we have a look at these things, is that we have a limitation into what we can measure, and then we have limitations into how we've conducted ourselves in terms of interpreting what we're measuring. So if we look really, really closely, we now know that there can be just these really very subtle elements of low oxygen level, and we can measure very subtle changes in brainwave patterns, which is what we call an arousal, so the brain is starting to be stimulated. And we don't normally measure these things in the fine detail that some of the research things do. What that means is that we're not seeing them. If we don't see it, we don't fix it. If you don't fix it, then these kids suffer. So breathing, it's remarkable really that we never have to think about it. And because we never have to think about doing it, we never really think about the consequences of it going wrong. It's an automated process. The brain essentially measures chemical levels in the blood and basically uses that as a feedback mechanism to work out if the breathing's going okay or not. And the brain will adjust the breathing relative to the messages that it's getting. And the problem is that if it's in the context of airway obstruction, the brain will put extra attention to that in terms of, for example, increasing that there's an issue, put more effort into breathing, but that extra effort achieves very little in the context of there being a blockage. And because these blockages result in the oxygen levels dropping down, and it doesn't like it, the brain goes into a whole series of things that ends up revealing themselves as dysfunctions. So, as they say, if the brain was so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we could not. Okay? It is the most complex thing that we have, and it makes us as humans really interesting animals in terms of our behaviours. And it's the control system, okay, of the whole nervous system, everything that I'm physically doing at the moment, from standing up to talking, to moving my hands, to breathing, to having my heart beat. My brain has got a hand in that with regards to what's going on. And if there's a problem, and the brain is also there as a vigilance monitor, and it will quickly respond. So if, for example, we're all here at the moment and suddenly there's an alarm that goes off, our brain is going to react and respond. Likewise, if the oxygen drops, it reacts and responds. And in doing so, the brain, obviously doing what it does, is sending all these messages and signals everywhere, and it does that through chemicals, what we call neurotransmitters. And then we can actually even just measure these things and get an idea of, what is the brain doing? We can look at the brain by taking pictures of it. We can look at the brain by measuring its electrical activity, and we can measure the brain looking at its chemical activity. And these things all integrate in terms of the knowledge that we assimilate. And what's very important for sleep is the brain has to be allowed to do what it is programmed to do from beginning to end without any disruptions, without any distractions. And anything that interferes with that ability for it to flow through a preordained sequence affects what we call sleep architecture, and in doing so really mucks up what the brain was trying to achieve through the sleep. So when we have a look at children, if they are snoring, we can see during the daytime that their attention spans are reduced. We can see that they have higher levels of social problems. So that could be, for example, reflected in their behaviour. That could be the kid that's getting into fights and arguments at school, the kid that is disruptive in the class. We see higher levels of anxiety. We see higher levels of depression. These kids are tired, so they are struggling. And related to that, their cognitive abilities, for example, their reading and their writing suffers. They have troubles with their memory. The actual ability to retain things and learn is contingent basically on what you accumulate today will sit in this little storage centre of your brain, and tonight your brain's going to revisit all of those things, and it's going to cherry pick off the things that during the course of the day you seem to attribute more information to than others. So as a result of that, your brain is going to filter out the keep and discard. And if your brain doesn't get the opportunity to do that properly, then it all just goes into the discard pile because it needs to be consolidated for keeping. And then we have problems with what we call executive function, which is using what we've got to work through problems and solve situations. One of the things that happens also is that with snoring, because of the oxygen changing, and the brain needs to respond to that, one of the ways it does that in terms of the low oxygen is it says through the feedback loops, give me more blood. And the blood flow to the brain actually changes in children that are snoring. And in doing so, the airway obstruction doesn't have to be that significant for the brain to respond in a significant way. The brain is very much geared to getting the oxygen that it wants and needs, and it will do so over the priority of every other part of the body that it can control. And then in doing so, when we actually go and fix these kids, we can see the blood flow returning to normal. Of course, that's an important thing. It's all well and good to identify a change, but then we need to say, look, does the treatments that we offer then result in a return back to normal? And that is definitely the case. And then what sort of gets interesting is that when we help these children, then they do better at the puzzles and the tests and so forth that we present them, and their concentration improves as well. And we've had a talk about the snoring and sleep and eyes. Well, we can actually do very specific tests in kids and adults where we look into the eye, and we're looking at the back of the eye, and at the back of the eye is where the nerves from the brain go into the eye, and we can actually see those things and take photos of them. And we can also see what's going on in and around those nerves. So for example, those nerves have fluid, brain fluid around them. And when we take pictures of these eyes, we can see that the nerve fibres going into the eye are actually physically damaged. And part of that relates to low oxygen, and part of it relates to the fluid pressure inside the brain being elevated. So because we're pumping more blood into the brain, As a consequence of that, we get a slight fluid pressure elevation, which affects these nerves. And as a consequence of that, it actually affects the vision. Now, admittedly in a very subtle way, but that's cumulative over time. And you've got to remember, I'm talking about children. So we're talking about children that part of their brain damage is visual loss. Okay? And as I said, we can measure the brainwave patterns, and when we do so, the brainwave patterns become abnormal in these children. So the brain is functioning, or really dysfunctioning, in response to the breathing issues. And part of this is represented by the fact that we have these sort of sleep patterns or sleep architecture, and we have these very distinct phases and waves, and it becomes disrupted. And as a consequence of that, it translates into behaviour problems and mood problems during the day. And one of the things that we look at in children that are functioning is this thing called ADHD, because we have children that are not concentrating and they're not focusing, and they are disruptive. The problem is that a good number of these children almost certainly actually have some sort of breathing problem, and then there's a consequent sleep problem. And the confluence of those two things results in the dysfunctions that we're seeing. They can also have problems, with all sorts of other parts of their brain. So the parts of the brain that process speech, which means that not only, as I said, their vision is being affected, their concentration is affected, but just by virtue of listening, the words that come in and the way the brain processes those words is affected as well. So you have a child in a classroom that's not able to filter out the background noise that could be distracting. It all gets blended together, and these kids get very confused in the classroom as to what's going on. And when we look at these kids, specifically at ADHD, and we've looked at the studies of the studies of the studies, and we've looked at, for example, before and after ENT surgery. And what we find is that getting tonsils and adenoids out, so that's the standard treatment for a lot of these kids, decreases the ADHD symptoms in a huge number of these kids when we look at the many studies that have been published. And it's been recommended for a very long time that before any consideration of even a diagnosis of ADHD, let alone medication, is that sleep-disordered breathing needs to be assessed for, needs to be considered because of this overlap with symptomatology, okay? And the big study is one that came out where they looked at 11,000 children. This is a massive study. And what they did is they looked at these 11,000 children roughly every 6 months or so for the first 7 years of their life. And there was no interventions, it was purely observations. And in doing so, they were on the lookout for snoring, mouth breathing, and stopping breathing, which is the sleep apnea. And in the children that had a history of at any stage through the first 7 years of their life of having that on a consistent basis, 2 time points in a row, so roughly the 6 months, higher incidence of behavioural problems, higher incidence of emotional problems. So that's things like getting upset really easy, getting angry really easy, hyperactivity, aggression, depression and anxiety. Okay, when we look at mental health in children, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar affective disorder, ADHD, ASD, and post-traumatic stress disorder are all overrepresented in terms of the numbers that we see and the consequences on that child. When we looked at this particular study, there's a 50 to 90% increased chance of developing ADHD-like symptoms if they had a period in their life where they were not breathing and sleeping properly. And for those children that were suffering really badly early on, the younger it happened, the worse off they were. And furthermore, even if they stopped, the breathing problem, in inverted commas, got better, because that was a paradigm that we used to have, is, oh, they'll outgrow it. When they had a look at those children later on, they were actually still suffering the effects of not sleeping properly. So we need to find these children and we need to intervene. The outgrowing it philosophy has been debunked plenty of time before now. As you can see, 2012, so we're nearly up to pretty much our 10 years down the track, yet the paradigm still hasn't shifted in the mainstay. The other thing is teeth grinding and the relationship to these children being, in inverted commas, stressed. So grinding the teeth, the top, we call that bruxism, just to show off fancy words, and they can be cracking and chipping their teeth, and it was used to be linked to a psychological problem, but as I say, is that, you know, there's not many 4-year-olds that are worried about losing their job, paying their mortgage, working out how to put food on the table, and then having their partner find out that they're cheating on them, okay? We do see children now and then that do come from stressful environments for various reasons, but in the mainstay, these children are not psychologically stressed, they are physiologically stressed. And the physiological stress is because of low oxygen levels. And we know that if we find these kids that are grinding their teeth and they've got an airway problem, and we address that, 80% of the time they will stop grinding their teeth completely. The teeth grinding is a symptom of a problem. It's akin to the siren going off, sounding the alarm, trying to say, hey parents, I'm in trouble here, I'm tired and exhausted, I'm not waking up, but the brain's trying to make a noise for you to notice that you need to get me breathing better in a hurry. Okay? And we see these patterns that basically, and it follows a very distinct pattern. What happens first is the oxygen drops. The brain responds by increasing the adrenaline surge, so the heart rate goes up and the blood pressure goes up. The next thing we see is the teeth grinding, and part of that teeth grinding triggers a reflex that is designed to bring the blood pressure back down to normal again. The other thing, as I said, is we can look at these brain chemicals. So we see changes in two things that some people have heard about called serotonin and dopamine, which are also implicated in depression and other psychological problems as well. So we start to see these clues and suggestions that start to come in as a confluence to understanding the pathology as to why we see, you know, these problems playing out. And part of it also that's important to realise is that not all breathing is created equal. So when it comes to mouth breathing, people will say, oh, well, they're mouth breathing, it's okay, it's the same air going into the same lungs, what's the difference? Well, there's actually quite a big difference in terms of how the consequences play out. And in simple terms, when you breathe through your nose, you tend to take the air to the lower parts of your lung. When you breathe through your mouth, you tend to take the air to the upper parts of your lung. The reason that's relevant is that most of the blood is in the lower part of the lung, which means if you're breathing through your nose, then you're taking the air and hence the oxygen more to where the blood is. If you're mouth breathing and you're taking the air more to the upper part of the lung, that means there's a blood that flows through the lungs that doesn't get the full oxygen dose that it should. And it's a subtle difference, but the consequence of it is a very slight drop in the oxygen level. And the thing about children is that they're very, very susceptible and vulnerable to even a small drop in oxygen. So the measurements of oxygen that we have in adults and children are very different as to where the line in the sand is. So with mouth breathing, you tend to lose about 2%, which doesn't sound like very much. The problem is that as soon as you hit 96, 97% in children, that's when the brain starts to struggle. So just by mouth breathing, you're pushing to the edge of the cliff already. Okay? And it's not just the brain, okay? We have, as I said, you can see problems with the heart. So these children at night time are developing changes that put them at increased risk of developing high blood pressure as adults, okay? And it's quite likely that a lot of people that have what we call in medical terms essential hypertension, or what we call primary hypertension, which means that there's no underlying cause for it, it just happened, probably stems from the fact that they were set up for failure from the beginning as children. Because one of the things that happens when you have this sleep disordered breathing, you get these adrenaline surges, is that the blood vessels start to get stiffer and tighter. And the consequence of that is that when the blood pumps through them, the pressure gets elevated. So again, we have this big problem where children are just not being treated properly at all. Okay? And the consequence of this over time, really, the long-term knock effect with, for the brain and the damage it causes is things like dementia, okay? And when we look inside the brain, we look at, the brain, and then we can do blood tests. So for example, with Alzheimer's, which is a particular form of dementia, there's certain types of proteins that are deposited in the brain that we know are associated with this disease. We can do blood tests for those, and we can see evidence of those proteins elevated in children. Okay. As I said, we can also do brain scans. Okay, so we can scan the brain and look at things like the size of the brain. And in kids with sleep-disordered breathing, the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking, for conflict resolution and attention, they are struggling to perform. And we put these two children, one with breathing problem, one without, through the scanner, and measure the parts of the brain. We can see different parts of the brain that are basically dysfunctional. And their brains are actually physically smaller on average. The brains are shrinking because of the death of the tissue within it. And this has effect on, even things like their fine motor skills. So even writing, for example, starts to go off course. And as I said, Alzheimer's, it's a form of dementia, and we have these proteins, which again, we drop the oxygen, we can start to see these things happening. And the problem is that more than 25% of children, don't worry even about AHD, have some sort of sleep disordered breathing in their lifetime. Varying enormous effects that can have on the individual and also the family and the school and their health. So it's really important to understand that children are not supposed to snore. They're not supposed to snore, they're not supposed to mouth breathe, and if they're doing that, especially as a sort of the biggest indicator that you've got a problem is a child that wakes up tired. A child that's waking up tired is a red flag from a medical point of view. It may not be due to a breathing problem, it could be something else entirely. But regardless, in the context of where there's obstruction, the best results are finding it early and fixing it early. We're ending up with permanent, lifelong health problems through inactivity and inattention to these kids. So that's what I just wanted to run you through in terms of the brain side of things. Again, I know it can be confronting to hear, child and brain damage in the same conversation, but that's the reality that we need to bring to the table. And we need to also bring to the table the reality that these children waiting on wait lists for over 12 months for an ENT review and then a year or two for intervention surgeries is really not consistent with what the science and the research shows. Those children are really being set up for health problems later on in life through no fault of their own, and circumstances prevailing. So again, I just wanted to thank you all for attending, and again, give the opportunity to make sure we have enough question time.
Absolutely.
So I've done that well. Any questions or feedback?
Yeah, David, I just got a sleep study at the Marvel, especially in your latest survey, with a 7-year-old, my little mate, who's a snorer, and he's observation 5 and observation 1
Yep.
and for the night answers.
Yep.
I know a result back where you said about truth over down on the little light of Woody.
Yep.
And so is it not true? I should, I'm treating you to go back to the QCA.
Yeah, so one of the things that's important to be mindful of is that a normal sleep study does not mean normal breathing. Okay? A normal sleep study means on that particular one night, they did not have sleep apnea. Okay? Sleep apnea is the worst end of the spectrum. Okay? He could be a snorer without sleep apnea. That's still a problem. You could be a mouth breather without snoring. That's still a problem. In those two scenarios, you'll have a normal sleep study, but you don't have normal breathing and you don't have normal sleep. Okay? Sleep studies, in terms of their predictive value, in terms of which children, if you have a child and you do a sleep study, and you say, well, this child's going to do really well out of surgery or not, you can't tell. Okay? A sleep study, I don't even bother with them, because it doesn't tell me if a child needs to be fixed. The number one question there's a lot of questions I go through, but in sort of the pinnacle of questions, the number one question that's the turning point in the consultation, do they wake up tired? Oh yes, surgery. Full stop. That's the end of the story. We're done. Okay? It's sort of like they're snoring, they're mouth breathing, and they wake up tired. We're done. Unless it's a medical condition like hay fever that might respond to medication, that kid's getting surgery because that's what they need, and they need it sooner rather than later. Waiting for a sleep study adds to the delay in the actual treatment they need, and then it also leads to false reassurances because they'll go, oh, they didn't have sleep apnea that night, they're okay. This is the next problem. If you do a sleep study in the same person, adult or child alike, 2 nights in a row, 40% of the time, 40% of the time, you'll get a different result. That'd be the equivalent of you going, I'm really tired, we do a blood test, and one day we find you're anemic, and the next day you're not, and we've done nothing. Huge difference in terms of the findings, huge difference in terms of the implications. So, obviously if the sleep study is abnormal, well look, that just confirms what we could have already worked out without one, is that they're not breathing and sleeping properly and they need surgery. Sleep studies do play a role. I don't want to disparage them, but in the mainstay for mainstream, in inverted commas, normal children, if they're snoring and they're mouth breathing, or you've noticed that they stop breathing at night, we don't need a sleep study. We don't need a sleep study result, and we certainly don't want to be telling people, oh, the sleep study's okay, which means they're okay, because it's nonsense. I saw a kid literally yesterday who has got really bad hay fever. You can hear him talk, like he's talking like this, all right? Mouth breathes like crazy, okay? He'd already seen an ENT that had looked inside the nose and said, yeah, you're really blocked, to take the spray, and if there's any problems, let me know. This kid was saying he has memory problems. He told me yesterday, I have problems with my memory. And I said, is he waking up tired? He's exhausted all the time. He's had a sleep study. The sleep study was reported as normal. The problem is that the sleep study, his oxygen levels were dropping down to 91%. That's bad in a kid, but he didn't have sleep apnea. This kid is completely blocked. He's waking up tired. He's got uncontrolled allergies. He's got memory problems. He's got learning problems. He's gone from doing really well at school to just struggling to survive. He's basically, as soon as mum picks him up, he's 11, drives him home, he's falling asleep in the car. People are not listening to that kid's story. They're looking at some numbers on a piece of paper and treating numbers and completely missing the fact that this kid can't breathe properly. And that's the problem with what we've got, is that we're trying to use numbers to just be a substitute for clinical assessment. I don't need numbers to know that this kid's in trouble. I can hear the story, I can hear the kid talking, I can see inside his nose that he's super blocked. They've tried the sprays, they're not working. He needs an operation, okay? And he needs to go and see an allergy doctor. He'd already had the allergy testing by someone else who'd found the allergies, and no one sent him to an allergy doctor. It's just the logic was just completely absent in terms of keeping it simple. People tried to make this too clever, overthinking the problem. This was a really easy problem. Allergies, can't breathe, drugs not working. Right, unblock, allergy doctor, let's start getting this back on track. Oh, now you're in trouble.
I was just wondering if it's possible to grab a list of your references. That
there's a lot of them there.
Do them on SMS via
I
Facebook?
think they said if they've got the video, they'll be able to just pause and sort of, yeah. Yeah. I've got hundreds of references. So if you want to, I'm not here to promote myself, I'm just here to educate. If you really want to dive deep, if you're on Facebook, I've got a Facebook page, Dr. David McIntosh. I put a scientific paper up almost every day. And most of it's the new stuff that keeps coming out, but sometimes I put the old stuff up. What's really, really disturbing, the stuff I'm telling you about right now, we have known about this since the 1800s, if you go back and read the papers, okay? 1800s, they worked this out. They worked out way back then that there were these kids that were not breathing properly, not sleeping properly, struggling at school, and you got their tonsils and adenoids out, and they did a lot better. Now, admittedly, back then, we didn't have anywhere near the hay fever allergy problems we've got now. There's a few changes that have come about that introduces that into the conversation. They didn't have the obesity problems back then. That changes, the conversation. But to keep it simple, we're talking about stuff that's near, on the border of 150 years ago. When you go and read the science and read the papers of people just using their brains and making observations and applying an intervention and seeing a benefit. Yes, Matt.
Good afternoon, Dr. David. My name is Chandra. I've got 3 questions. I'm not sure if you've got ample time to answer these. Okay, let's
Got
throw
all
it.
the time in the world.
The first question is like the linkage between the brain, the heart, the lungs.
Mm-hmm.
See, brain sends the electrical impulses, like you said. It's the neurotransmitters which are there. They just keep on sparking the neurons. And we talk about the brain dead before we declare that a person is dead.
Mm-hmm.
So the breathing is controlled actually by the heart. So long the heart's pumping, it sends the lungs to keep on breathing. So how that links with the brain, that's what I need to understand.
So what drives our breathing is what's called the respiratory center. It's in the brain stem. In there, it's got what's called chemoreceptors, and what they're measuring specifically is the pH, the acidity of the blood, and the pH is affected primarily by the carbon dioxide level. So when we metabolize, we create carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide goes and washes over this part of the brain. If the carbon dioxide is elevated, the way that the brain compensates for that is to increase the respiratory rate and respiratory effort to breathe the carbon dioxide out. So it's a very tightly regulated system. As long as the brain is working properly, it's the brain that controls breathing. So people think it's oxygen that actually drives breathing. It's not. That's the backup system. If for some reason the brain is dysfunctional, there are no oxygen receptors in the brain at all. They are all in the periphery, so around the blood vessels around the heart, for example, in the blood vessels coming up to the brain. But that's a backup system. The primary driver of breathing is the carbon dioxide level, which is detected by, as I said, the respiratory center in the brainstem.
Awesome. My next question is regarding the, like in kids, they tend to have nosebleeds. And that nosebleeds, is it just the something to, it will impair the brains or brain cells, or is that something going to be because of the breathing? That's the issue that comes in.
Yep. When there's a story of blood noses, what I do is break it up into daytime and nighttime blood noses. Okay. Daytime blood noses are usually the heat of the day, or running around or picking their nose from trauma, and sometimes they can have some infection in the nose that exacerbates that as well. Nighttime blood noses is a very different story. Nighttime blood noses, and this applies in adults too, by the way, is often, not always, but often a reflection of a blood pressure spike. So children that are having blood noses at nighttime, exclusively at nighttime, they've got breathing problems. What's happening is their blood pressure is going up. That is resulting in the fragile blood vessels within the nasal passages tearing under that pressure, and as a result of that, they get the bleeding. Noses, as a rule, bleed a lot. Remember what I said, that one of the things that happens is that these children respond by having more blood pumped up to their brain. Now, it can't differentiate between, basically it's going up into their head, all right? So what goes up into the brain through one will also go up through another channel to the rest of their head, including through their nose. So with extra blood volume, extra blood pressure, they get these blood noses at nighttime. So nighttime blood noses is an indicator of potential high blood pressure in anybody, and if specifically at nighttime, you tie it in with a breathing problem.
So as regards the daytime, I mean, the reason the kids tend to have the nosebleed is just because of the exertion or the physical.
Yeah, like I said, they often have an infection underneath that makes the lining fragile, and then if you have a hot day or they're just picking their nose, they'll get the blood noses for that reason. The other thing to always be mindful of is they could have an underlying bleeding disorder. So every now and then their blood will be thin for a medical reason, and we need to find that. So we often ask about, do they have any other issues with bleeding, like if they cut themselves, or do they tend to have a very minor knock or bump that leads to excessive bruising? So that's what we call a bleeding diathesis. What it means in English is thin blood, and we need to pick up on that, because obviously that has major implications if there's an underlying bleeding disorder in a child, and the only clue at the time is a blood nose. So that's always on our radar of concern, to make sure that we don't miss that as part of the presentation too.
So when the kids go for exertion, probably they are losing the lot of the water, or if they are doing any physical. So it must be not thinning the blood. It might be like the blood's.
Yeah. So when I talk about thin blood, I'm not talking about the viscosity. What I'm talking about is what I'm talking about is their coagulation system. I'm just using a generic lay term. So when I use the term thin blood, what I specifically mean is that their clotting system is not working properly. And then the other thing, like you said, with the exertion, one of the things that happens with exertion is it puts up your heart rate and your blood pressure. So that's where the exertion and the blood noses can come into play as well.
Fantastic. Just the last question. See, in the night time when I'm sleeping, I tend to have the brain stops thinking of. I mean, I tend to have like sort of. It's something which wakes me up. I tend to think of whether I was breathing or not. So is that something the sleep apnea related, or is that something which is...
So potentially, obviously, it's the same in children. Disrupted sleep is a problem, okay? And then, kids that, for example, or adults, kids that wake up, 3, 4, 5 times through the night, that's not normal. The kid that wakes up and is coming into the bedroom of the parents, that's not normal. It's been normalised, but it's not normal. Likewise, the adults, the typical one with the adults is having to get up and go to the toilet, at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. That's not normal, but it's been normalised. This is where, as a medical healthcare community, we've done a terrible job of education and sharing our knowledge and drawing the public's attention to what's normal and not normal. So as a consequence of that, the most fundamental things that we do, which is breathing and sleep, people have no idea in the mainstay just how aberrant some of these things are in people that just accept it as just being who they are.
We've got time for just one more quick question over here.
Thank you very much. Yes, Michael Prinius, David. I'm actually a dentist by profession, and I'm just curious about the connection between dentistry and medicine regarding, collectively helping in breathing patterns. And on a physiological note, this one though, for you today, and that is, you mentioned before about the carbon dioxide being the driver for the breathing through the respiratory centre, and you mentioned that somehow that's registered by the respiratory centre. Is that via the blood pH?
Yes.
How does actually?
Yeah, it's the blood pH.
So it only has to change.
So you have your carbon dioxide, oxygen dissociation curves, and all those sort of fine print things. But it's the pH, the specifically.
So there's an oscillation sufficiently monitored by the brain, by the respiratory centre, to be able to fire off the next inspiration.
Correct.
Just when the level just gets a little bit up, and that's what...
very tightly regulated.
Blood pH, yes, okay. Well, that's, without going into any more questions and details, thank you very much for that.
No, that's all right. I think there was one more we might sneak in as well.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a short, quick question. For a surfer, which is myself, sometimes when we surf, we accumulate a lot of water in our nose. And sometimes, because I am tired, I want to sleep straight away, and basically that night I'm snoring terrible. Is this any effect because I didn't drain my nose? And actually, when I drain, it's coming quite a lot of water in my nose.
Water in the nose doesn't cause a blockage. The water, if it accumulates, it'll accumulate in the sinuses, which is not within the breathing channel. So what you're indicating is that, yeah, there's something going on that needs to be assessed and appraised beyond what you had linked as possibly being the cause.
Okay, but this thing doesn't happen all the time. It's only when I have a heavy surfing session and then basically...
Yeah. There's a range of conditions that are not always consistent or persistent. So again, it's only really by having a good and proper look that some clarity can be made. Rather than speculate, it's always best to just cut to the chase and get the definites rather than focus on the maybes.
Thank you.
Just one, bad dreams. I was if I come and ask my
Okay, so ants in the bed, yep, so ants in the bed is there's actually a technical word for it. It's called formication. That's F-O-R-M, just so you know. All right, it's from the Latin formica, meaning ant, just to show off. So that's called formication. What it is quite possibly a reflection of low iron levels. It ties in with what we call restless leg syndrome. Children with sleep disordered breathing, somewhere between 25 to 30% of them have low iron levels. And it can also be another reason why they'll grind their teeth at night. Low iron iron's also a neurotransmitter. Having low iron has a complex effect within the brain. So it's not just necessarily low oxygen levels that can trigger teeth grinding, but low iron can trigger it. But low iron can also trigger this thing called restless legs, and it's sort of described as you've described, you know, that sort of feeling of, you know, things crawling under the skin, for example. Yeah.
at school where there's come home from there and this is the storm and
Obviously, I'm not diagnosing, but I'm hearing what you're saying. You've got a problem. He needs sort. He, she, they need sorting. You need to see an ENT. That's what you need. I'm only a normal person too, but I do this a lot.